Morning, and we're going to pick up this morning where we left off last week in the series of lectures on the Reconstruction era as we wrap up this Civil War and Reconstruction course. So this will be one of the last two lectures for the course. And today we'll be talking about congressional or radical Reconstruction and what Eric Foner referred to in his tome, Reconstruction, the emergence of the activist state, as he calls it, and that was a federal government that assumed enhanced powers to effect change that it saw as necessary, and which continues to be on into the 21st century, a concern for some people about state activism and the lengths to which federal power uh, can be extended over the lives of people. So a lot of these political issues that were the issues of the 1860s during Reconstruction, once they are affected, we begin to see these same questions persist moving forward in the future through the progressive era, through particularly the presidency of Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt in the 20th century, um, and then much later on, even into the 21st century with recent administrations. So let's talk about the congressional or radical Reconstruction. And here, as we pick up, last time we talked about how the Republican Party, now in the months after the Civil War has concluded, has begun to increasingly shift toward the left and to link with radical Republicans, that wing, that minority, but powerful minority wing in their party, which had at one point been the sort of outcasts. These were the former abolitionists. These were the people who thought that initially the Civil War should be a war to end slavery, when most people simply wanted to fight for union. And now, here we are 4 years later, and they've really sort of become the bell cow for the party now. The entire party is united over the issue of emancipation. The entire party has sort of now shifted toward that ground for equal Black legal rights, and increasingly more and more members of the party are becoming convinced of the need for universal male suffrage, that is, for Black male voting rights. So it is largely the policies and attitude toward Reconstruction of Andrew Johnson, which has caused these moderate and conservative Republicans to begin to change their political stance and move increasingly into the radical camp. Now, of course, if we look at Michael LeBenedict, or it's Les Benedict, I'm not actually sure how he pronounces it, who was a Ohio State professor. I'm not sure if he's retired at this point. His essay, which we read, and which some of you just wrote papers on, he argues very interestingly for the innate conservatism of the radical Republicans, and how that they essentially always left the issue of creating legal change in the hands of the states, and that they may well withhold statehood from them until they made those changes. But the policies of the radicals always ensured that the federal government did not cross that line of constitutional limits, and the federal government changed the state laws on its own. It would withhold statehood from the state until the state itself changed its laws. So it was an interesting, very interesting, and I think fairly convincing case for the innate conservatism of radicals, which is pretty neat, I thought. Anyway, so I always enjoy rereading that essay. So let's talk about the break with Andrew Johnson. Let's talk about what sort of were the final matters that broke the relationship between Andrew Johnson and the conservative and moderate wings of the Republican Party. So let's get out of monologue mode now and get into the lecture. So it begins early in 1866 with controversies over two bills, each of which was introduced by Lyman Trumbull, a moderate senator from Illinois, who had been a close advisor to Abraham Lincoln, actually. Trumbull was the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and the two bills. Did I say Illinois? He's from Ohio. I apologize. I got that one wrong. The two bills were to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau, number one, and the second bill was a civil rights bill, the first such proposal in American history for a law governing civil rights in the United States. All that existed at that point was the Bill of Rights, but not a specific law that would actually define American citizenship, I think is the best way to put that. So the first bill was a bill to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau. As we talked about in the last lecture, the Freedmen's Bureau was originally only organized to exist for 1 year. It was seen as a temporary expedient. But Trumbull was concerned with the magnitude of problems in the American South at this point. He assured the Senate that it was not intended as a permanent institution, but that nonetheless it was easy to see that there was still a lot of work that needed to be done in the American South. And so the proposal was to extend the Freedmen's Bureau for an additional year. The other bill, the Civil Rights Bill, as drafted by Trumbull, first of all, defined all persons born in the United States, except Indians, as national citizens. Secondly, it spelled out rights that they were to enjoy equally without regard to race. These rights would include making contracts, bringing lawsuits, and enjoying the quote unquote full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of person and property, so that every person could be secure in their rights to life, liberty, and property. Right? And this goes back to the sort of original natural rights theory that really shaped the Anglophone political and legal world. And these are essential natural rights coming out of John Locke in the late 1600s. Right? The bill went on to say that no state law or custom should deprive any citizen of what Trumbull called these fundamental rights belonging to every man as a free man. And again, this is going right back to John Locke and his political philosophy. And lastly, it had an enforcement quality to it. So this is really putting meat on the bones of the 13th Amendment, okay? Because the 13th Amendment just said everyone's free, which is awesome, but it doesn't really protect anyone in their daily life, right? So, and now this puts enforcement power, this puts teeth in the 13th Amendment. So the bill authorized federal district attorneys, marshals, and Freedmen's Bureau officials to bring suit against any violations of any citizen's rights. So it allowed for these cases to be heard in federal courts, not state courts. Okay. And it made all persons, including local officials who deprived a citizen of their civil rights, liable to fine or imprisonment. Okay. So this again speaks to Benedict's sort of interesting take by saying here that, well, the freedmen could sue in federal court for violations of their civil rights. And by the way, this would pertain as well to white Southern Unionists who were being harassed by former Confederates. So who are actually still mentally and attitudinally Confederate, just no longer militarily Confederate, right? And this was the whole point of Richard Henry Dana's grasp of war theory, right? That while and Carl Schurz makes an interesting point also in a report that Congress requested of him, and we used to have that in a former document reader I used. But while the South was no longer fighting, while the war was over in a military sense, in terms of a sort of social attitude, right? As I said earlier, attitudinally, Southerners had not surrendered. And so this is really the issue that the radical Republicans are dealing with. Okay, that there was not a spirit yet of giving it up. So anyway, back to the Civil Rights Bill. So in constitutional terms, the Civil Rights Bill represented the first attempt to give meaning to the 13th Amendment, to define in legislation the essence of freedom, and it offered the first statutory definition of citizenship in American history. So it embodied a very profound change now in federal-state relations, according to Foner, right? And it reflected how ideas that were once considered radical had been adopted by the party's mainstream. So it was not just for blacks and limited to the South as well, right? So this invalidated discriminatory laws in the North, right? In places like Philadelphia, for example, where there was great controversy over discrimination on public streetcars. There were segregated streetcars back in the 1860s, and that was a cause of a lot of lawsuits in the North following the passage of the Civil Rights Bill. So it would invalidate discriminatory laws in the North. It would obviously protect the freedmen, and as I mentioned earlier, would also protect white Southern loyalists or unionists. So, and it would also protect federal officials in the South from being discriminated against. So it was a broad-ranging and again a national law. By February 1866, the Republicans had united. Now, getting back to the larger narrative here, by February of 1866, within just a period of a few weeks, the Republican Party had united behind both of Trumbull's bills. They were viewed as necessary amendments to presidential reconstruction under Andrew Johnson. And it was thought that these would go a long way towards forging some sort of a compromise with Johnson. The Freedmen's Bureau extension bill passed Congress almost unanimously. I mean, despite people's constitutional sort of scruples about the Freedmen's Bureau. Even Johnson's supporters voted for it at this point, but Johnson, to everyone's surprise, vetoed the bill. He continued to believe in a strict construction sense, that the Bureau was unconstitutional, that it was unaffordable, and it was an encouragement to the freedmen not to work. So the Senate vote to override his veto fell 2 votes short. This should have given Johnson some warning of the dangers of his political course at this point, speaking to the sort of groundswell of opposition to him. Yet he couldn't believe that a majority of Republicans would really oppose him over the issue of federal protection for the freedmen. He really could not believe that a bunch of white Northerners would make this bunch of a big deal over the freedmen. Whereas many Republicans saw his veto against the party and the freedmen. A lot of people had seen this coming, right? When the Civil Rights Bill passed, again, almost unanimously, Johnson also vetoed it. And he wrote in his veto message that federal protection of Black rights and the broad conception of national power behind it violated all our experience as a people. So his veto now of the Civil Rights Bill is often considered to be the worst mistake of his presidency. It destroyed his chances of ever again regaining any cooperation from the Republican Party. So Andrew Johnson is now really a lame duck president within about 9 months of taking, well, no, let's see, that's about a year. Because his inauguration would have been in March. So within about a year, Andrew Johnson has already become a lame duck president. And at this point, his only hope of election in 1868, right? So think now we're in early February of 1866. He was elected vice president in 64. So in order for him to be reelected president, or actually elected president for the first time, right? Because he succeeded to the presidency. In order for him to be elected in 1868 now, he needs Democratic majorities. Okay. And in order to get any work done as president, he needs for the Democrats to retake the House of Representatives. 1866 will be a midterm election year. Every seat in the House will be up for election, and a third of the Senate will be up for election. So Johnson now, his only hope is to see strong Democratic majorities in both houses, or at least sufficient Democratic numbers in Congress to obstruct Republican efforts. Okay. So let's talk about the 14th Amendment. So in June of 1866, Congress went even further in defying Andrew Johnson by passing and then sending to the states for ratification the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. This amendment defined everyone born in the United States or naturalized as an automatic citizen. With all the privileges and immunities granted by the Constitution, this included equal protection of the laws by both the state and national government. It also barred any state from taking a person's life, liberty, or property without due process of law. It declared the Confederate war debt null and void and guaranteed the Union war debt. So this erases the sort of illegal existence of the Confederacy. And because the Confederacy itself was illegal, it declares all debts null and void. Okay. Northern taxpayers and business groups had refused to reimburse those who had financed the rebellion, right? And the federal government agreed on the necessity of maintaining the good credit of the United States government, while at the same time saying that no one was going to be able to collect on any monies that they had loaned to the Confederate government, including foreign powers. So if France and England had decided to loan money to the Confederacy to fight their war, or had given them weapons and ships on credit, waiting for cotton or something to pay for these purchases, too bad, you backed a loser. You backed a government that was declared an illegal government that was hostile to the United States, and we're not going to pay those debts, so don't come trying to collect in U.S. courts or anything like that. This was there had been efforts to collect in American courts debts of loyalists and English, particularly suing in American courts after the Revolutionary War for loss of property, loss of loyalist property. So the United States government, in this point, after this rebellion by Southerners, which had seen some foreign financial backing, they're just nipping this in the bud. What's going on here? Okay. It prohibited former members of Congress or other federal officials who had aided the Confederacy from holding any state or federal office unless they were pardoned by a two-thirds vote of Congress. Okay, so we don't want any Alexander Stevenses sitting in Congress. And lastly, penalties would be imposed on any state for denying suffrage to any adult male citizen. So here we now are seeing, prior to the 15th Amendment, we are seeing that all male citizens could vote as a part of the Civil Rights Act. And the penalties would come in the form of reduced representation in Congress and the Electoral College. So if a state were to violate the civil rights of any male citizen, that state would have its representation in Congress and the Electoral College reduced. So congressional radicals offered also to readmit any state whose legislation, or legislature, I should say, ratified the amendment. So as long as any Confederate state ratified this amendment, they would be readmitted to the United States. The only one to do so was Tennessee. All the other former Confederate states and Kentucky and Delaware refused. So the radical Republicans were therefore left without the necessary 3/4 majority necessary to enact the amendment. However, the political environment was changing, and the radicals were soon to solidify their power over Reconstruction policy. So while the first attempt to pass the 14th Amendment was not there because they did not have the 3/4 majority of the states ratify it, that would happen fairly soon, within the next year. And what begins to change all this is the 1866 elections, which I mentioned earlier. Okay. The congressional elections of 1866 were some of the most important midterm elections in American history, and we typically only focus in our studies of electoral politics on presidential election years. But this was one of, if not the most critical set of midterm elections in our history, because it was all essentially focused on one issue. The elections became a referendum on the 14th Amendment. There had been bloody race riots in Memphis and New Orleans, in which large numbers of blacks were killed. And this added to the national clamor for the protection of freedmen and freed women's rights. The eruption in New Orleans, in which the victims were mostly black delegates to the state constitutional convention, and the Army did nothing to provide for their protection, despite their awareness of potential trouble. So this was a big blow to Andrew Johnson's presidential Reconstruction policy, that these sorts of political conflagrations could take place with these outrageous and violent violations of black civil rights in the southern states. And Johnson did not order the Army to take any role in protecting these people. So it hurt Johnson greatly because it occurred 2 weeks before the National Union Convention in Philadelphia. So this was a big blow to Johnson's sort of political standing. Even more damaging to Johnson was his infamous Swing Around the Circle tour. This was an unprecedented effort by Johnson to raise political support for his party in the upcoming elections in 1866. So he essentially went out stumping for Democratic candidates in the northern states. He was hoping he could therefore strengthen his hand in combating radical Republican policies. On August 28th, he embarked on this whistle stop tour, during which he would address large crowds from the back of a train. So we've seen these scenarios in films before. If we ever watch old Western films or films about 19th century, where the train will come pulling into a station. It's all adorned in red, white, and blue bunting and festooned in decorations. There's a band playing. There's women with baskets of flowers, and the political candidate pulls up, and the band starts to play, and they step out on the platform of the caboose, and they take their hat off and wave to the crowd, and then they give a speech for 10 or 15 minutes, and they go back into the caboose, and the band starts to play, and the train goes off down to the next station. That was called a whistle stop tour, and that was a major form of political campaigning in the 19th and early 20th century. This was actually the type of tour in which Woodrow Wilson was engaged when he was stumping for the League of Nations in 1919. Some of you may remember from our U.S. History 2 course. So Johnson makes these whistle stops throughout the North and the Midwest. And at first, in places like Philadelphia and New York City, Johnson fared fairly well with his audiences because he's in the centers of American commerce and finance, right? And the commercial and financial elites of major metropolitan areas like Philadelphia and New York, again, his message of Johnson's initially taking the position that Reconstruction's over, right? I mean, just to remind you from the last lecture, he's saying, okay, 13th Amendment has been passed. There are no slaves anymore. Let's get back to business. And remember, Johnson is a member of the white Southern yeoman class. He wants to see this class actually take its place in the South, right? They've been sort of stepped on by the planters historically for centuries. Johnson came up out of that class. He has a chip on his shoulder toward the planter class. And the main thing he wants to see is the planters torn down and the white Southern yeoman taking control of the South. He's not looking to in any way assist the federal government in preferring or giving any kind of special treatment to the freedmen, because the freedmen are now going to be put on a social level equal to the white Southern yeoman class. And he doesn't want them being able to get a leg up on the white Southern yeoman class. So Johnson has his own sort of class and racial interests. And as far as he's concerned, Reconstruction's over. Let's get back to just doing the business of America. The Southern problem is resolved. So with financial elites in the North, this message resonates. Let's get on to settling the West. Let's get on to the business of business, so to speak, to paraphrase Calvin Coolidge. Again and again, Johnson delivered the same speech, calling for reconciliation between the North and the South, affirming the loyalty of the Southern whites to the nation, arguing that suffrage requirements, in other words, whether or not freedmen may vote or not, should be left to the states themselves. It should not be a matter that's imposed by the federal government. He never, during his tour, once mentioned the 14th Amendment. He ignored that issue and went on talking about other matters, about let's get on to business as usual. However, when his tour turned to the Midwestern states, Johnson became the victim of constant heckling and jeering crowds, with whom he would argue back, right? So Johnson, many had observed, was compromising the dignity of the office of the presidency, mortifying even his own supporters by arguing with these crowds, going back and forth with them. In St. Louis, he was actually blaming Congress for instigating the New Orleans riot. And he unloaded on his political enemies during his speech in New Orleans, which I won't quote him here, but he likened himself to a victim, someone who was being martyred when it was actually Congress who was doing all the bad activity, right? One political observer believed that Johnson's tour ultimately wound up costing his party 1 million Northern votes in the congressional elections. So radical Republicans wind up winning overwhelmingly in the 1866 midterm elections, the congressional elections, as a result of Andrew Johnson's efforts to campaign for Democrats. Radical Republicans won overwhelmingly. After the elections, the Republicans held a majority of 42 to 11 in the Senate and a 143 to 49 majority in the House of Representatives. So overwhelming radicals now have a veto-proof, they now have veto-proof majorities in both houses of Congress. And at that point, Andrew Johnson was political toast. He did not have a leg to stand on. Any questions? Okay, so let's talk then about what Congress is going to do. So now that Congress can do what they want, they can pass bills, and Johnson can't veto them because they can override any veto. The Congress now can begin to enact its own policies for Reconstruction. So in early 1867, Congress passed 3 Reconstruction bills. Each time, Johnson vetoed them, and each time, Congress overrode the veto. The first Reconstruction Act was passed in March of 1867. Tennessee was readmitted to the Union because it had ratified the 14th Amendment. Congress then rejected the governments of the other 10 southern states that had been established and readmitted under Lincoln and Johnson's plan. So you recall Lincoln had his 10% plan. Johnson had his plan for Reconstruction. Numerous states had been readmitted. Congress kicked them all back out again. Congress then, because there were now going to be new rules for being readmitted, and these states had not met those rules. Remember, all these states had rejected the 14th Amendment the previous spring during that failed ratification process I just talked about. Congress divides the South into 5 military districts, and a military governor who had to be an Army general at the rank of brigadier general or above was appointed to be the governor of each district. That general / governor would have the power to register qualified voters, and this meant adult males, black and white, who had not rebelled. Once these registered voters were all registered, they would elect delegates to state constitutional conventions, where the states could begin now the process of, I should say, they're not states. So this is one of the interesting theories that was being discussed in Benedict's essay that you read last week. This was the state suicide theory, right? One of the congressional theories that was being used you remember Richard Henry Dana's grasp of war. In other words, these are conquered territories. We're going to hold them in grasp of war until they do what they want, right? Since they won't register the 14th Amendment, ratify the 14th Amendment, we're not going to allow them to be states. So we kick them out of the Union, and they have to draft new constitutions that meet what we want. So they're being treated now not as states, but as conquered territories. And this is grasp of war, but this is also the state suicide theory that once the states seceded and rebelled, they had committed suicide. They were no longer valid states under the United States Constitution, and they had to be completely remade. Right. So both of these theories sort of apply here. So they all have to draft new constitutions that contain provisions that are going to guarantee black suffrage in the South. When those constitutions were ratified, voters could then elect state governments. Congress would have to approve each state's constitution, and the state legislatures all had to approve the 14th Amendment. So this time there was no way getting around the 14th Amendment. You either ratify it or you're not going to be a state anymore. Well, you're already not a state. You won't get to be a state again. Let me reframe that properly. Okay. Once all this was done, and enough states had ratified the 14th Amendment to make it a part of the Constitution, former Confederate states could then rejoin the Union. So this is really the Congress putting the hammer down now and looking to make sure that the Southerners weren't going to continue with a sort of states' rights sort of mindset after the whole states' rights theory had been defeated on the battlefield. Okay. Now, during the period from March 1867 to March 1868, over that year, 3 more Reconstruction Acts would pass that detailed things like the operation of voter registration boards, the actual adoption of state constitutions, the administration of good faith oaths for white Southerners, how that would take place. But within a year, by 1868, 7 of the 10 ex-Confederate states that had just been kicked out were readmitted. Okay, those were Arkansas, North Carolina, South Carolina, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. They had all met the conditions prescribed by Congress and were readmitted. White conservatives in several states were able to delay those states from returning, and these were Virginia and Texas, until 1869. So Virginia and Texas were holdouts who did not want to get on board. They were able to hold out until 1869 and managed to keep their states out. And then Mississippi finally was readmitted in 1870. By that time, however, these states were forced to ratify the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment forbade the states and the federal government to deny suffrage to any citizen on the account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So those 3 states, Virginia, Texas, and Mississippi, all had to ratify the 15th Amendment in order to take their places back in the Union. Of course, the other state legislatures, which had just been accepted under readmittance, would have all ratified the 15th Amendment, okay, as readmitted governments. Okay, Congress also not only was looking to, that was my son peeking into wave to me. The Congress also took methods or measures, not just to curb the actions of white Southern state governments by remaking, the Southern political complexion under sort of biracial state governments. But Congress also passed laws to safeguard their programs from presidential interference because Andrew Johnson continued to have several powers as president. Even though he could no longer veto, he still had several constitutional powers that might enable him to try to throw a monkey wrench into government changes as they were taking place in the process of Reconstruction. Several of the laws um, that had been passed by Congress were of questionable constitutionality, and Johnson was in no position to prevent their passage. So Congress is going to pass these laws to curb executive privileges, uh, which again are constitutionally questionable, but Johnson was not in a position to do anything about that. The first of them was the Tenure of Office Act. The Tenure of Office Act forbade the president to remove civil officials, including members of his own cabinet, without the consent of the Senate. Can't do that. The president wants to fire one of their cabinet secretaries. They have the right to do that. Now, recall, Johnson has inherited Lincoln's cabinet. They want to make sure that Johnson can't fire any of the cabinet members around him and replace them with people who can therefore affect the operations of government by messing with Reconstruction through particular government agencies, right? Denying supplies, things like that. Attorney General, replace the Attorney General, could create constitutional problems. So they want to make sure Johnson can't fire any of his cabinet, which is a presidential prerogative. It really, Secondly, the Command of the Army Act. This limited Johnson's power over the Army by requiring him to issue any military orders that he wanted to issue through his position as Commander in Chief directly through the General of the Army, Ulysses S. Grant. And Grant himself could not be removed or reassigned without the consent of the Senate. So they want to make sure that Johnson can't do anything, first of all, to mess with military reconstruction, right? The South had now been divided into 5 military districts with a general governing each district. Johnson, as commander in chief, could remove any of those generals and put in a general who might do what he wanted, right? Someone that was a close political ally of his or a supporter of his. Hopefully, a Democratic general, someone like a McClellan. Remember, the Union Army had been full of Democrats, the Army of the Potomac, that were hostile to a war to get rid of slavery. So possibly some of them might have served Johnson's interests better than generals who had been loyal to Lincoln, like Sheridan, like Sherman, okay, and certainly like Grant. Okay, so it looks like Andrew Johnson is pretty well hemmed in here. However, he's not going to take this lying down. The political defeats, the overriding of his veto is one thing, but treading on his constitutionally given executive privileges was quite another. And so Andrew Johnson decides he's going to intentionally violate the law. Okay, he's going to intentionally violate one of these laws, which he sees as unconstitutional. Remember, Johnson is an attorney, and he must have been a pretty good attorney because he got elected to the Senate and later vice president and president, right? So he understands law. And in December of 1867, there had been an effort by James Ashley of Ohio, a radical Republican, to impeach Andrew Johnson. But there was no sufficient grounds for impeachment. Okay. In fact, the idea of impeaching Johnson had arisen several times early in 1867. And so radical Republicans began searching for some grounds upon which they could get rid of Andrew Johnson. They didn't like the president. Congress didn't like the president. Congress, controlled by another party, didn't like the president, wanted to do anything they could to try to get rid of him, and so they're looking to impeach him. Even though they had made an attempt to impeach him and been defeated, they were emboldened by this. And Johnson, they're still looking for a way to get rid of him. In the 1867, there were some elections in 1867 that were held. Democrats made some gains in northern states during fall elections in 1867. So Johnson looked at what was going on and this is state legislature, right? So Johnson's looking at northern state legislative elections during 1867, and he is seeing the Democrats gaining more and more seats, a few northern governors, more northern state congressmen and state senators. And Johnson now begins to believe that, okay, things are beginning to swing his way. So he becomes emboldened by this, and he decides, I'm going to test one of these laws because I don't think they're constitutional. And if I am attacked for this, this will help to get me more support. So Johnson decides he's going to violate one of the laws. He also begins to encourage Southern opponents of Congressional Reconstruction, and he wants to remove some officers, military commanders, in favor of more conservative officers who he thought would disobey Congress. So he does exactly what the Command of the Army Act says he can't do. He removes military officers and appoints people he thinks will violate Congress's dictates. And then he tried to remove Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Stanton was a Lincoln appointee who, although he was a Democrat, he originally was a Democrat who didn't like Lincoln. Lincoln won him over. He became sympathetic to the radical cause and sort of really loyal to Lincoln's memory. When Congress refused to remove Edwin Stanton as Secretary of War, Johnson removed him himself on February the 28th. Of 1868. And this is just a great scene in American history. I mean, this is right out of like Shaggy and Scooby-Doo or the Skipper and Gilligan. You can picture them piling up, there's a ghost outside the room and they're piling up the furniture in front of the door, right? And, of course, the ghost comes through the wall, right? But here's Edwin Stanton, who had been forewarned of this action. Stanton used his furniture to barricade himself in his office, refusing to surrender his cabinet post. Johnson characteristically sent federal troops to break the door down and physically remove the Secretary of War from his office. In doing this, Johnson had violated, and he knew this quite well, the Tenure of Office Act. And what he hoped was that it would not withstand a court test, right? He had the hope of testing its validity in the courts. That this would come to the courts and the law would be struck down as unconstitutional, and this would strengthen his hand. However, Congress finally had what they were looking for, and this was grounds for impeaching Andrew Johnson. So the House radicals quickly and happily impeached Johnson and sent the proceedings to the Senate for a trial. Right, and we've just been through this whole circus recently, right? In the end, the vote in the Senate fell one vote shy. The vote to acquit Andrew Johnson was 35-19. It was one vote shy of the two-thirds majority required to convict him. It would have the radicals would have needed a vote of 36-18. But the vote came in 35-19. So they were one vote shy of a two-thirds majority, which would have removed Johnson from office. So Andrew Johnson survives this impeachment effort. And honestly, what he had done was to violate a law that Congress knew was unconstitutional. They passed a law that they knew violated the Constitution just to curb his executive privileges, which Congress did not have the power to do. So as unpopular as Andrew Johnson may have been, and as poor of a president as Andrew Johnson may have been, and that his policies on Reconstruction may have been wrong, whether morally or legally, the fact of the matter is that the law that Congress passed was unconstitutional. Anyway, the great upshot of this process was the radical Republicans wind up suffering more from this than does Andrew Johnson. Okay, there's going to be a blowback for this. They passed an unconstitutional law, which the president violated, and they tried to impeach him for it. And that's going to have consequences. Okay. Now, Andrew Johnson would not be reelected in 1868. That was a no brainer. This was not going to save Johnson's presidency. But it painted the radical Republicans as a group that were out of control. You violate the Constitution and try to impeach a president. That has consequences. Okay. So now the radicals lost a lot of their political momentum, and the moderates in the Republican Party, those who voted to acquit Andrew Johnson because they saw the actions of the radicals were wrong, and that's why Johnson was acquitted. The moderates now gain control. The moderates now begin to steer the process of Reconstruction. And also, we now begin to see the power of financial questions, what people then would have referred to as sound money issues, beginning to enter back into the political conversation. It was the first indication that the people of the North were getting tired of Reconstruction and race issues and wanted to see the conversation return to sort of American affairs of business, of post-war economic development, of the settling of the West, of restoration of normal sort of business procedures and government procedures, and not an unending focus on the affairs of the southern states. All of this made the nomination of Ulysses S. Grant inevitable. A career Army man, except for a brief unhappy period in the 1850s, Grant had steered clear of politics for most of his life. During the Civil War, he had distinguished himself through his courage, his genius, and his determination. He had cooperated, remember, the first person to actively hold the rank of lieutenant general since George Washington. Okay. Grant won the Civil War, make no bones about it. It was Ulysses S. Grant who defeated every major Southern army, right? I mean, certainly Sherman toward the end of the war, and troops who were served under Sherman had taken care of Joseph Johnston and John Bell Hood, and mopped up the former Army of Tennessee. But fact of the matter was, after Grant had won most of the southwestern United States, he turned things over to those guys, went back east, and knocked out Robert E. Lee. Ulysses S. Grant won the Civil War. Okay. In doing that, he had cooperated fully with Lincoln and Congress in implementing policies such as emancipation and the raising of Black troops. He emerged from the war as the nation's preeminent military hero. He was aware of this talk of his being nominated for the presidency as early as 1866. The rumors and scuttlebutt are circling about. He had never been elected to anything in his life. Again, he's a career Army guy. He initially tried to keep himself and the Army clear of Reconstruction policies. That's government, this is politics, that's civil, we're military. He understood, the lines, had no interest in blurring them. However, one congressional policy by 1868 had called for the implementation of a structure of governance that involved military districts in the American South. At that point, it became very difficult for the Army to stay clear of Reconstruction politics. That was off the board at that point. And he was, again, the commander of the entire Army. Nonetheless, as one Republican candidate put it, his candidacy had a conservative odor to it. This was because of Grant's lack of ideological convictions. He was by no means a radical. Okay, so he didn't have a cause, so to speak, and also because his earliest promoters of his presidential candidacy had been this sort of great conservative and commercial interests in New York. Those who had once actually supported Johnson, right? So New York City's business elite feared a Democratic victory would reopen the now settled Reconstruction question. While on the other hand, a Grant presidency um, offered the prospects that moderation, fiscal responsibility, and stable conditions for investment in the American South would result from a Grant presidency. So a healthier, more stable, predictable climate for business and investment was what they were looking for. And Grant seemed to promise that because he was not an ideologically driven guy like the radicals. Okay. These people were joined by moderates who aligned themselves with Grant as a way of weakening radical influence within their state parties. Okay. People were by 1868 tiring of the radicals. Okay. Other Republicans lamented an Illinois radical supported Grant merely because, quote, they think he can be elected. It's a bad sign when we take men instead of principles. Some people worried by this. Grant was being put out there just because of his electability. He didn't have any principles to stand on. He didn't have a cause, but he was electable because of his moderation and military reputation. So the radicals weren't really too keen on Grant. They didn't see him as someone who would advance their policies. But nonetheless, Grant will win a landslide victory in 1868. His election was aided largely by the new Southern Republican Party. Um, the new and extensive Black voting base of the post war South, the exclusion of former Confederates from the process, brought huge returns for Grant in the reconstructed Southern states. Okay, now again, this would have included at this time Virginia, Texas, and Mississippi would not have been able to participate in this election. Southern blacks voted in huge numbers for the Republican Party, as this was the party that had endorsed and enforced their freedom in both war and peace, right? Republican governments rose up after that in all of the reconstructed states. Delegates to Southern state constitutional conventions had been slightly over 25% black. So you had these biracial political coalitions in the Southern states. Many Southern blacks also would serve as representatives in their state assemblies. Some would be elected to Congress, like Robert Smalls of South Carolina, and other offices. For example, P.B.S. Pinchback served as both lieutenant governor and governor of Louisiana. Blanche K. Bruce served as a U.S. senator from Mississippi. And others like Civil War hero Robert Smalls of South Carolina went to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives later. So we would see a lot of black political figures serving not only in state but also in national government during this brief window of biracial political cooperation in the United States prior to the eventual what was called the redemption of the southern states, which was, of course, the period that I will discuss in my next lecture, which was the period of white Southern democratic governments reasserting themselves in the American South. So again, these times were the nation's first and only experiments with biracial coalition government. So what was this coalition that I'm speaking of here? Well, it was a coalition of, first of all, free blacks, and these would have been educated free blacks like ministers and teachers, and then the Creole classes of the South, and this was particularly true in Louisiana, those who had been sort of free black Creole classes prior to the war. We're not talking about ex-slaves here in that respect. And then yeomen, that would have been the people that Southerners would have referred to, many of them as scalawags. A lot of these coming from the upcountry regions of the South, where these were independent yeoman farmers who did not have slaves, who had been trampled within the politics of their own states by the interests of those counties representing the interests of the planter classes, right? The Black Belt counties of a lot of these states, Tidewater sections of Virginia, etc. These were people who wanted education. They lived largely in mountain areas of the southern states and were anti-Confederate. These were your Unionists. Okay. Um, Most of them don't support these racial governments, but want their voice in politics. And then you have the Northern Whites, the carpetbaggers, those who have gone down there as part of the Reconstruction process, or former Union officers or soldiers who had some capital and decided to buy some real estate and stay in the South after the war. These are people who are particularly loathed by the Southerners. So this combination of Northern whites, yeomen, and freed blacks makes up the biracial coalitions. For many in the South, uh, this is white Democratic Southerners, it seemed a case of genetically and economically lesser men now lording it over their betters. This creates great resentment in the South. And again, this is that sort of attitudinal persistence in war from ex Confederates who are only ex Confederates in a military sense. Okay. Um, so, emerging from this whole era of these biracial coalitions, this is very important. And a major piece of the sequel class I teach, American Civil War Memory, which again I'll be teaching in summer 3 this year online, if anyone's interested. Um, this creates the myth of what was called Negro rule or Black misrule. Okay, and this would greatly impact the final phase of Reconstruction and would also color historical perceptions about the Reconstruction era for generations. Okay, and these sort of historical perceptions will be part of the canon of American history as it is written by the professional historians of the late 19th and early 20th century. And it is those histories that Hollywood will rely upon in producing its films about the era for mass audiences later on, because they're going right to the texts, they're going right to the historical sources to create correct reproductions of the era, right? So when you ask a question like, how could someone make a film like Gone with the Wind in 1939? Because that's what the history books taught. Okay, so very, very critical are the sort of the post-war memoirs, the post-war histories that are going to um, write their own versions of this, these sort of Southern versions of the era are going to be the versions that America is going to learn and rely upon. Okay, that's just a little introduction to the course. Okay, all right. So anyway, while the era was a time of active Black participation in state and national elections, conventions, even office holding, they were largely underrepresented uh, class in important Reconstruction political posts. And for the most part, they held lower echelon jobs in politics, such as clerks and other sort of honorary positions. So while there certainly were those, like Blanche Bruce, who made it all the way to the U.S. Senate, these are exceptions to the rule. And post-war blacks in the American South also were savvy enough to understand that they only represented 25% of this coalition, and they were only going to be able to affect so much political change. And so they put the emphasis of their efforts where they knew they had the best chances to affect changes that could be meaningful for themselves in the American South. And so therefore, they really concentrated on education reform as the main thrust of their political direction. Okay, because of the relative economic power of the former planters in the South, they held the vast majority of the land, and also because of the political power of Northern whites who held the majority of the available capital. Okay, so put yourself in the position of the freedmen involving themselves in Republican politics in this post-war period, right? We're involved in politics, but the former planters own all the land, the Northerners have all the capital. Black Republicans realized they were in no position to press for revolutionary economic or social change. They didn't have the political capital. So they focused instead on pressing state governments to spend money for public school construction for both Black and poor white children. These would be separate facilities, of course, but this would create now schools and an education platform for Black children and even Black adults. Okay. So, as mentioned previously, the Freedmen's Bureau was also very active in this effort, but now they're pushing the southern state governments to allocate their budget monies into this process also. And again, they understand, as mentioned previously, the Freedmen's Bureau, while active in this effort, was also set up as a temporary expedient. This was not going to be a permanent government agency. And once the Freedmen's Bureau and its funding was removed from the equation, taken out of the picture, okay, what would then happen to the education process for Blacks in the South? And so this is why they're pushing Southern state governments to direct energies and funds in this direction also. This concentration of Black politicians in the South went hand in hand with the creation of a sort of Black social fabric, now a free Black social fabric in the American South. The creation of independent Black churches. Um, this really represented the forging of independent, free Black communities throughout the American South at this point. While the availability of land did not always permit the creation of insular Black enclaves in the South, right? They don't necessarily have the land to create those sorts of communities all the time, especially in a lot of areas where slaves had represented the greatest portion of the local population. These communities came together more easily. So if we look at states like, let's say, Mississippi or South Carolina, where there were counties where slaves outnumbered whites 9-1. Okay, it's easier for forging these sort of insular free Black communities, right? Because of the vast amount of Blacks and their ratio to whites and land availability would be therefore be greater. Whereas in states where Black slaves represented a lower portion of the community, right? That would have meant there were fewer large slaveholders. That would have meant there were more independent white landholders. And this would lessen opportunities for Black landholding and therefore widespread Black landholding that could see the creation of free Black communities. Okay, so this is not going to be, if you were to look at the South like a quilt, right? There are all these sort of areas of the South, there are all these states, there are all these counties within the states. You're going to have, it's going to be different. So, sort of like if we're listening to conversations going on about reopening the United States right now on the economy, right? And what did the president call it? A beautiful puzzle, he called it, right? There's a beautiful puzzle. So we look at this puzzle. You've got all these different pieces, right? You've got all these different states, and you have some counties where, obviously, like look at North Jersey or New York, there's just this massive explosion of this virus. But you have places in Wyoming where you might have 8 people with it, right? You can have different conditions on the ground. So that's what I'm talking about here in the southern states after the Civil War and the opportunity for the emergence of these free Black communities. It's going to be conditioned to realities on the ground in particular counties. While the availability of land didn't always permit the creation of these sorts of Black communities, with this new personal, political, and social and religious freedom that Blacks were now able to enjoy, things certainly began to look more promising for them by 1868. So by 1868, Southern Blacks had acquired enough legal and social rights and freedoms that there was certainly a much more promising picture for them at this point. However, with the Reconstruction question seemingly quote unquote settled, and the Northern economic elite pressing the president elect, Grant, to turn the government toward capitalizing the new industrial might that had produced by the Civil War, Southern Democrats now begin devising new plans for a return to power. They're not just going to sit on the sidelines. Okay? Southern Democrats now begin to abandon the rhetoric of race, and they begin to turn Southern attention, that is, the attention of Southern voters, to economic issues. Okay? And what they did was they hoped to move away from the very conservative image that they had created for themselves and rally Southern, yes, even Southern Black support against Yankee taxes and interference. So Southern white Democrats, get this, believe that not only can they easily convince white Southerners that they need to look to their economic issues and the hardships being imposed on them by Yankee taxation for these new school systems, et cetera. They're also going to be able to convince free Black voters that you have more in common with your old friends who had protected you and treated you well, the Southern Democrats, than they do with these Yankee carpetbaggers. They're looking to strategically use your old friends, the planters, as a wedge that they can drive into this Republican Party coalition in the South. Let's get rid of Yankee taxes and interference. And if that didn't work, they had other ideas. And we'll talk about those in our next lecture on redemption, which will be the final lecture for this course. And we'll be talking about the era roughly from about 1869 to 1877, the end of Reconstruction. So thanks for listening. Be safe out there, and we'll see you in the next show.